Welcome to the tutorial adding textures and gradients to a pencil line. So to begin, let's take a look at brush strokes and what we know about brush strokes in order to discover the new properties of the pencil tool. So I'm going to select the brush tool from the tools toolbar and create a stroke with minimum 5 and a maximum pressure of 30. Then I'm going to select the pencil tool, which also has a minimum of 5 and a maximum of 30, and make a similar stroke. So if we use the contour editor on the brush tool, we can see that a vector contour becomes visible that's dotted with points. And if you select one of these points, its Bezier handles appear. So by selecting a Bezier point and moving it or rotating its handles, we can essentially change the form of this stroke. However, if we use the contour editor to select a pencil line, we see that there is actually a central vector line dotted with points, and that if we select one of these points, we can move the line, but we can't really essentially change its form. So its width stays the same, but the form changes by the action of adjusting these Bezier points and their respective handles. But we also know from having watched the previous tutorials that there is a way to adjust the vector contour of a pencil stroke as well, and that's by using the pencil editor tool. So let's select that and then select the pencil stroke once again. And if we move one of these points, we can see that it does act very much in the same way as the contour editor with the brush stroke. So they're virtually identical in that respect. So now let's add a gradient fill to both of these lines. So if we scroll down, I've created one here. So I'll just select the brush stroke and then the gradient swatch and do the same thing for the pencil line. So immediately we see several differences. We can see that with the brush stroke, it looks like it's filled with what could possibly be a large swatch with this rainbow color, and we happen to see only that part of the swatch that is made available by this vector contour. For the pencil line, however, it really looks like a brush with these colors painted the stroke. They follow the form of the stroke, and in fact they actually follow the form of the central vector line. It's a little difficult to see here because it is orange and the central color is yellow. So let's try using the contour editor on these two strokes once again. So if I select the brush stroke on top and I move this vector point, we can see that this rainbow color just gets extended and the form of the stroke essentially has changed. However, if we do the same thing into the pencil line, this continuous rainbow color or gradient color follows the form of the stroke no matter how we move these points. Then if we use the pencil editor, which can only be used on pencil strokes, so not on brush strokes, we can actually manipulate the envelope of the pencil. So let's select a point and pull it upwards. So unlike the brush stroke, when we lifted up a point and we saw this color just continue, you'll notice that the color here is becoming warped a bit. These stripes are actually trying to follow the outer contour of this stroke. So they're trying to form to that contour, whereas with the contour editor tool and the brush stroke, this color just fills up to the point of this outer vector contour. So you can see the difference quite clearly here. The last tool that you can use on both of these strokes is the Edit Gradient Texture tool. So if we select the brush stroke, most of you are familiar with this, you can use this handle to rotate the way that this gradient fills this brush stroke. And you can also shrink it and move it to displace how the gradient is shown through the stroke, as well as to squash or stretch the gradient. So, for example, if I did want to try to fill this entire stroke so that you could see at least all four colors in this gradient, I could try to make it as small as possible and then as parallel as possible to the stroke. But of course, it'll never look the same as a pencil line stroke. It'll never follow the curvature of this stroke. If we then select our pencil line with the same tool, you'll see these sort of controls appear at the end of the pencil line. And let me zoom in one more time so you can get a better look. If we grab the first box here and lift upwards, you'll see that the blend between two colors became greater and that we can no longer see a few of the colors like the blue and the green, for example. So we know right away we've stretched to some extent that color. And if we do the opposite, we'll see that we can see the entirety of the entire gradient once again. You can also grab this box. This doesn't really mean much for a gradient. It works more with the texture fill. And you slide it across. I kind of did two things at once there, so hold on. And we slide it across. What it's essentially going to do is stretch or shrink a tiled pattern. So we're going to see that with the leopard fill. It doesn't really mean much for a gradient fill. It's mostly this up and down that makes a difference. So now let's try filling these two strokes with a texture fill. So once again, a gradient fill is vector based. It's just like any of these other swatches. If I double click on the tongue swatch, we see the color picker. We see that it's a solid color, but this is a vector based color. If we click on the gradient, we can see these 4 color markers here. We can see that it's gradient. So this is how this color was made. However, the green leopard fur is actually a PSD that I imported. So to create a texture color pot or texture swatch, you actually have to import either a TGA or a PSD, which are of course bitmap based. So I'm going to select the select tool, select the brush stroke, and then click on the green leopard fur. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the pencil stroke below. So right now, both strokes look very similar, but let's put them through the test once again of using the contour editor, pencil editor, and edit gradient texture tools. So if we start with the contour editor and we look at the brush stroke and we lift a point, we'll see that once again, this fill continues upward. So it just really changes what the stroke form looks like. However, if we select the pencil line and we move a point, we're actually changing the position of the stroke, but not its width. However, if we then use the pencil editor on the pencil line, we can see a vector contour outline, and then we try to perform a similar action, we can see that this texture fill actually stretches, because once again, it's really trying to conform to this outer vector contour. It's not an envelope or a mask hiding a textured rectangle underneath its vector contour. Okay, so let's take a look at the Edit Gradient Texture tool now for the brush stroke. So automatically a set of controls appears, and as we know, if we grab this handle, we can rotate that texture. If we grab any of these white squares, we can warp the texture. If you grab the corner box, you can scale the texture. And then if you grab this corner pivot point, you can actually reposition the texture. However, when you use the same tool on the pencil line, you'll notice that the controls are a bit different. So once again, as we saw with the gradient fill, you can actually scale the fill as well. But you can see the difference right away, that here it's stretched, and here when we scale, it scales uniformly. You can also take this square and it automatically follows the central vector. And what it does is it's essentially stretching the tile that makes up this texture or shrinking it. And if we bring this back down, you can see it goes back from being stretched. So they look more like circles, but just a lot of little circles. And here we see that the circles have been stretched in the opposite direction. And you can play with that until you get the pattern that you like. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is not just filling these strokes with textures, but actually drawing them with textured brushes. So I'm actually going to delete these 2 strokes, and then I'm going to use the brush tool with a black swatch to start, and a textured brush, draw another brush stroke. And then I'm going to do the same for the pencil tool. I'm going to select a textured brush, so it's going to be the charcoal brush here, and then also draw a stroke. So already we see a pretty big difference. You can tell that the texture that makes up a brush stroke is bitmap based, and it's pretty obvious because it's a bit blurrier at the same size than the pencil brush stroke, whose tiled texture swatch is made up of a vector image. And in that way, these strokes are in fact a bit lighter than the strokes that are made with the brush tool. So let's do our tests again. I'll start again with the contour editor. Obviously, if we move the contour back, this time this pattern doesn't follow, it just expands the vector contour for no good reason really. And once again, if we select a point from the pencil line and move it, we're just moving the position of the line, but not necessarily the form. And in this case, we're not moving the form or changing the form for either stroke. Then if we use the pencil editor on the pencil line to bring up its vector contour, and we modify that envelope, you can see that the texture is actually getting stretched inside the same way it did with both a gradient fill as well as with a texture fill. So it's always trying to follow that line. And as we saw with the gradient fill, that actually looks quite nice because it looks natural, the way that rainbow pattern followed the central vector. And in this circumstance, I'm pretty sure you cannot use the Edit Gradient Texture tool, but let's just try. So no, you really can't for the brush stroke, but you can, however, for the pencil stroke. With a gradient or texture fill, we saw that the set of controls actually started at the top of the stroke, and now we're seeing a set of controls at the bottom of the stroke. And we'll see this come into play later on. So once again, I can move this entire set of controls to shrink the tiling and therefore make it more dense looking, or once again spread it out. I can also stretch it, so we're seeing a concentrated center, it looks more black. I can shrink it, it looks smaller, for example. So there's many things you can do with the Edit Gradient Texture tool with the pencil lines texture. So now let's actually try to change the color of our texture with a texture. So you can do it with either, right? You can actually give it a gradient fill or you can give it a texture fill. It works either way. So it's really interesting to be able to have a texture with a texture. So once again, that's with the gradient. Let's do a direct comparison. And then texture on texture. So right away we're seeing some really interesting things. Obviously the pencil line seems to support these fills a lot better. They're a lot sharper, they look a lot cleaner, and they look more solid, for example. Of course, that has a lot to do with the actual texture that was specifically used to draw this brush stroke and then the one that was used to draw this pencil line, but it does have a sort of cleaner feel about it. So once again, if we use the contour editor on our brush stroke, we're going to see just empty space. So once again, for textures on textures or gradients on a texture, changing the contour doesn't do anything. It doesn't change the form of the stroke. However, for a pencil stroke, if you select a point and move it, once again, even though it's texture on texture, you can completely change the position of the line. So it'll always follow the form of the line, no matter how you bend it, no matter if you layer gradients on top of textures or textures on top of textures, it all works together. Then if we switch to the pencil editor, just for the pencil tool, and we modify the envelope, of course we see what we expect. Not only is the texture being stretched to fill the vector contour of the pencil stroke, but so is its texture fill. So both the texture used to create the stroke and the texture that we use as the color to fill the stroke. Lastly, if we use the gradient texture tool, in this case we are able to use it on our brush stroke because there is a texture fill there. And I don't know how obvious this is going to be. Okay, so we can see that it is being rotated. It is being scaled. You can warp it. You can do all sorts of things. So you can still do that with a brush line. But now if we use the same tool on the pencil line, we see something very interesting. And let's zoom in to get a better look. We actually see two sets of controls here. So you may have guessed that the top set of controls controls the fill color, so whether it was a gradient or this green leopard print, while the bottom set of controls actually controls the texture that was used to make this brushstroke in the first place. So as we see, we can scale the leopard print both horizontally and vertically, and we can also make those same modifications to the textured pattern that makes up the stroke. And you can play with those until you get the desired effect. And you can get some really interesting stuff that looks like this. Like originally this was a leopard print pattern, but here it almost looks like a painterly paintbrush stroke, maybe made with like a knife or something. So you can get some really interesting stuff playing with these controls. And then one thing I wanted to mention while we're dealing with textures and pencil line fills is that if you select a textured brush, or if you give your brush a textured component and it has a tapered width, when you press at 100%, you'll get your texture, so this tile here, at 100% scaling. So let me show you what I mean by choosing something a bit more obvious. If I use the dotted brush, so let me show you, it makes these dots. These dots appear as ovals, and that's because I wasn't pressing to my maximum capacity with my stylus on my Wacom tablet, so it's not 30 at this width. However, if I press really hard and try to get that maximum width, you'll see that these circles look more like circles and less like ellipses, and that's what happens if you press to your maximum width. If you use something uniform, it might actually be more obvious. I think we have a uniform pen style. So like that. So you have no choice but to use the maximum because the maximum and the minimum are the same, and you get these perfect circles. So if you think about that in terms of one of these fuzzier textures, so like the charcoal that we were using, that's what the charcoal swatch actually looks like, unstretched, unscaled, undistorted. However, the moment you start using a tapered brush, say tapered pen style, and you always have to remember to select your choice of texture every time you select a different preset pen style. At a certain point, like where this line is tapered, this texture tile or this texture swatch gets distorted, and it really doesn't matter because here it looks nice and natural, so it's not a bad thing, but it's some extra knowledge that you might want to be aware of. Okay, so let's get rid of some of these lines here, and then we're going to talk about the texture component of the pencil templates. So we've already taken a look at some of the preset pen styles that exist here. We know that you can associate a texture with these pen styles. So something like that. We know that you can create your own pen style. We've created one here, my pen style 2. And that you can also associate a preset texture to that pen style. But what we haven't looked at yet is how to load our own texture to our own pen style or to one of the preset pen styles. So to do that, you have to click on this plus sign here in the texture section of the pencil templates. And with this, you're able to open up a TGA or a PSD file. So I've created this one, spotted texture, and the one stipulation is that it has to have an alpha channel. So for example, these PSD files are completely opaque. There are no sections of this file that have transparency at all. So this would not work as a textured pencil swatch. However, this, where you see the white between the solid black dots and the fuzzy black dots, that's all transparent. And so this will work as a swatch for a textured pencil. So I'm going to select this and say open. And then if we click on this drop down menu, we can see it's at the bottom of the list, spotted texture. And now with the new pencil style that I've created, I can create a stroke. So the other options that exist here, of course, is that you can delete the swatch that you just imported. So delete texture, you can rename it. So we saw that already. You can give your texture a soft tip, and that's just to make it softer around the start and end points. You can always check that or uncheck that, that's up to you. And what we have here is that you can make this texture available to this scene specifically, or you can make it available for all scenes that are opened on this specific machine. And you can do that just by clicking this arrow right here. So it says copy current texture into preferences. And so as soon as you see it here, you know that now it's available to anybody else who opens a new scene on your machine. The thing with textures that have been saved in the preferences section, they are not deletable. So you can delete this one, but you can't delete this one. And if you ever open up a scene and the swatch doesn't appear in the scene section, you can always transfer this texture that exists in the preferences of your computer to your scene. So if you see this blank, you can click on this arrow here and it'll fill up this blank area underneath the scene title, and that means now that this texture is both available on your computer and for your scene. So I mentioned before the only two file types that you can import in for a textured pencil style or pen style is either a PSD or a TGA. But as kind of an advanced tip, I'm going to let you know that you can also import a TVG, so a Toon Boom vector graphic. And this is kind of a neat thing to know, because that means you don't need a third-party software such as Photoshop to create these textures that you'd like to bring into Harmony. So you can create them obviously directly in this software. So I'm going to do that by creating a new layer, renaming that layer to new texture. I'll turn off the light table here, I don't really need it. And maybe I'll have no texture opacity, and let me create something like that, and that'll be my swatch. So then I'll save. And now when I want to create a new texture, and we get this window, I'm going to search for this scene file. So this scene is called Pencil Line, so let's look for this scene file. So pencil lines. So in my pencil lines folder, which houses my scene files, so my XStage, my .xstage file, there's a bunch of these folders that I think most of us are familiar with: elements, environments, frames, and jobs. So if we look in the elements folder, we'll see the names of our drawing layers, even drawing layers that have been deleted. And so the new one that I created was new texture. And I think I can only access it by actually putting TVG in this search field and then going to my new texture folder. So now on a Mac, I'm able to select this TVG. If you're using Windows, in the load texture file window, there's a field at the bottom that allows you to see the different file types that you're allowed to choose from, and you probably only see PSD and TGA there. So if you clear those choices and you put in a star or an asterisk, it's the same thing, and hit enter, you'll then be able to access the TVGs available on your computer. So I'm going to say open. And it's asking me if I want to do color recovery, and I'm going to say yes. And now if I go to the bottom of my list, we see new texture -1, and this is the texture I created. So this is actually quite a bit smaller than I thought it would be, so apparently you have to make it quite a bit bigger, and I think I just realized why. It's because I'm at 800 zoom, so if I was at 0 or I reset my view before drawing this, I'm sure this texture would have been a lot larger. So let's go back to this drawing space and let me draw with my new texture. So it's quite small, but you get the picture of how you'd be able to do that. So the one last thing I just wanted to discuss is this is the way that you can add a texture, as I mentioned, to preset pen styles as well as the new pencil templates that you've created. But in a previous tutorial, I showed you that you could create a pencil template by actually drawing it physically in the camera view, selecting it, and then clicking on this new pencil button, or new pen button. But the thing is, when you do that and you have an associated texture, it doesn't bring the texture with it. So let me actually use the pencil editor to reshape this. So this is our new pencil style, this is our new pencil texture, this is what I want to use to create a new pencil template. I'm going to select it, and then if we scroll all the way down here in the tool properties panel for the select tool, I believe it's also in the pencil editor tool properties panel. I can click on this button, and then if I scroll down, it's this new template, pencil template 2. So it has the shape, but if you scroll down, it has that old texture that we used because that happened to be the texture that was there for the pencil template My Pencil 02, which was the style that was selected when I created the new template. So like I said before, when you're creating a new pencil template, it'll take on some of the attributes of the pencil or pen style that happens to be in this drop-down menu. So it just happened to take the random texture that belonged to this pen style for this new pencil template, and it also made the ends blunt and flat because this pencil style happens to have flat start ends. So that's something you have to be aware of as you're creating new pencil templates with textures. So that's it for the tutorial, adding textures and gradients to a pencil line. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, pencil lines and the color override effect.